Good evening, everyone. It is, I'm sure I'm speaking for all of us. It's great to see you all here. Can you hear me? How's that? That better? Okay. It's great to see everyone. I'm Representative Larry Kraft and Senator Ron Latz and Representative Cheryl Youakim. We figured we would start, rather than jumping into discussion of session and special session, which we can get to. And by the way, when we get there, or at any point, if you have questions you would like to write down as opposed to get up to a podium and speak, Caleb has some pens and paper, and feel free to do that, and we can do it that way if that's more comfortable for folks. But we thought we would start with some reflections and questions, thoughts you may have on the assassination that happened and the attempted assassination of Senator Hoffman and his wife, Yvette. I guess I'll start by saying, many folks ask, so how are you doing? And I'm simultaneously okay, moving forward, and not okay. It's very hard to grasp what happened. Speaker Hortman was just an incredible person. I think I wrote in some communication that I was absolutely in awe of her as I became into the legislature, and the more time I spent with her and with her leadership. But beyond that, and she's an incredible leader, to herd together 66 to 70, opinionated, strong-willed folks into just an incredible team. But also she was a friend. And she wasn't infallible either. She certainly was intimidating given the stature she had, but once you actually got to know her, you would talk about things in a very normal way. She would express her doubts. She would ask opinions. And I felt like I had a very special relationship with her. And I think all of us in the caucus felt that, which was one of her unique qualities. So you may have seen there is going to be a public, she's going to be lying with her husband, Mark, and their dog, Gilbert, going to be lying in state on Friday from noon to 5, and that's open to the public. And then there'll be a funeral, a private funeral, but there is it'll be streaming on Saturday morning at 10:30. But with that, I'll see if my colleagues want to say anything. And if anyone has questions or things you'd like to share, or really anything just to talk about, we'll just leave some space for that, given the shock of what's happened.
Oh, sure. Sorry for being late. My son just came into town and we lost track of time playing cribbage. But yeah, it has been hard, and everybody in our caucus and our whole legislative family and Minnesota are in different stages of grief right now. I had happened to be out in Colorado celebrating our daughter finishing her medical residency, and had my phone on airplane mode because we'd been up really late the night before, but luckily my husband's body clock, being a teacher, gets him up anyway, so he was up 6 a.m. Denver time, which was 7 a.m. here, and I opened my phone to hundreds of messages and trying to figure out what was going on, and finally realizing in time to get a hold of our son, who also lives out there, who was flying back that morning to Minnesota for a wedding, to get a hold of him before he went to our house, because we just didn't know what was going on. Melissa and Mark were really special people, especially them as a team. Whenever you were out in an event and if you're alone, like if you didn't have somebody with you and you were hanging off to the side, Mark found you and chatted with you and asked how things were going and what you were working on. And the kids have asked us to make sure to remember him too, and they put out a wonderful statement about all the good things you can do in their memory, from baking a cake for Melissa or bread for Mark, to planting a tree, to petting a golden retriever, to make sure that you're upholding your voice and caring about things that you, saying what you care about. She was a great leader. This is my 11th year in the House, but I also watched from afar when I was in the Senate as a staffer with Senator Latz for 8 years. So I got to know Senator Hoffman a little bit too. And his wife Yvette is actually the sister of one of our former House members, Yvonne Seltzer, who was from out in this West Metro area. So I got to know Yvette too. But Melissa had a great sense of humor, and her and I have a propensity to like a good swear word. She was always very direct, and she was an incredible negotiator. But what I remember about her the most is that she found a way to figure out what you were good at and make sure that she gave you space to hone your leadership skills. Even when we were in the minority, like the second year in, she's like, you like to mentor people. You do the weekly lunch with the new members. Or she'd pull me aside sometime and go, this person over here is having some problems. You go do your mothering thing. Because she thought she wasn't warm and fuzzy, but she really was. She just had a tough exterior. And, she saw something in me to give me a gavel after 4 years. And she always loved to give advice, too, about negotiations because she was really good at it. So that was some of our last conversations around special session and working on the K through 12 bill. But I always learned something when she talked, too. I always thought energy was her jam, but then I found out she ran for office because of K through 12 funding. So that was very, very special to her. And she was right alongside her and Representative Stevenson in making sure we kept the formula linked to indexing to inflation. It's always hard when somebody leaves that suddenly, especially when it was that tragic. And I think we're all sharing kind of a collective, like, wow, this is a little much. My hope is between this session, which was very unique for us to be at a 67-67 tie, and having to work very closely together. Like when we had the trifecta and I was chair, I still met with my minority lead every week. We'd look over the agenda. I met with all the Republicans on committee. But the work we had to do together this year made me realize that wasn't enough. And we've also seen our members across the aisle grieve and a lot of people taking a step back from the polarization and the rhetoric, and I hope that might be the legacy Melissa leaves, but she's going to be our North Star for a long time.
So I spent 2 years in the House overlapping with Melissa Hartman before I moved to the Senate. And I knew her, not nearly as well as my two colleagues did, but shared the same impressions. I won't reiterate them. Senator Hoffman and his wife Yvette, fortunately, seemed to be on a path to living and recovering. And I know John pretty well. And he's a terrific, passionate fighter for people, especially those with disabilities, but in the human services sphere. I mean, that's where his business is, that's where his policy passion is, and there's a reason why, because he cares so much about people. So I will leave my comments there. Personally, I got a call at 5:15 Saturday morning. By the time I got out of bed and looked outside, there was already a squad car in front of the house. I don't know if it was there before I got the call or when it arrived, but kudos to the St. Louis Park Police Department for being incredibly responsive and doing their job so well. We moved out of the house for the weekend. I went back a couple of times, made sure I had a police escort when I did. And they were always very accommodating to make that work. It's okay and then not okay. I mean, I'm looking over my shoulder more than I used to for the first week anyway. If I heard a squad car go down the road, or even if I heard a loud noise, I would jump more than I usually would. Clearly, I was on edge. Part of it, we accept a certain amount of responsibility, putting ourselves out in front in the public, but never do we think that public service ought to be a death penalty, and certainly it ought not to include the family. So this is a pretty unique targeting and difficult to process that way. It's not new. I think the quantity and intensity may be new, I first got a death threat when I joined the city council my first year here in St. Louis Park in 1994, when we had to call the deer herd. And someone left a voicemail for me that they should do to me what we're going to do to the deer. Cheryl, you were, I think, at the Senate when there was an intruder, and maybe you'd already left.
I'd already left, yeah.
Yeah, there was an intruder came into the Senate chambers after we had adjourned for the day with a knife, plunged it into a desk, and said, "Where's Latz?" So I didn't talk about it at all. I didn't think it was appropriate or helpful to give that any oxygen. Haven't really talked about it until this last week. And that was handled, I think, appropriately in the justice system. But we all live with a certain amount of criticism. And so for those, I mean, it's part of the job, and that's appropriate when it's, policy-based. When it gets over to personal or into threats, it's a different story. So for those of you who have reached out, it's greatly appreciated. I think what's important for us here, and what's so heartening for me to see all of you here, is this was not just an attack on individuals. It turns out the individuals were, among many that were on the list. How you got on the list, I don't know. But it was an attack on self-governance. It was an attack on democracy, on the willingness of people to serve, and on the institutions of a self-governing society, from someone who apparently had substantial disagreements with some of what was going on with regard to public policy and so on. So to me, it's important that you showed up tonight, and I appreciate that. Each one of us and each of our colleagues are going to deal with this in different ways. Some are going to be more triggered or reactive than others because of their own personal experiences or personalities, and we'll all need our time to process it. But I intend to intentionally not be intimidated by it, to continue to show up, to speak my piece, and with appropriate security right around the corner, to make sure that everyone who comes to public events like this is as safe as can be. But I think it's important that we continue our work so that democracy continues to thrive. And with that, I think I'd be interested in seeing if anyone in the room has anything you'd like to add, to share. No obligations, of course.
I'd like to add. I'd like to add just one more thing, because you brought up a good point too. Is a lot of folks in public service have people come to them when they're not in a good space, and that they're desperate, and you're like their last chance or that last call. And it's not just us. It's anybody that's in public service. It's anybody that works at a city hall. It's anybody that's at a police department, a fire department. It's our teachers in our schools, being that one adult maybe that cares for that kid. It's our religious leaders. It is, I think about my daughter who's a doctor in a hospital. It has been that way for a long time. It does sometimes feel like it's getting worse, but my plea to everybody would be to try to always see that other person on that other side of that text or tweet or social media post that you're thinking about, to just slow down and count to 10 and remember they're a human being. Because I think we've become very fractured as a society that way, and forgotten how to get to know our neighbors and get to know folks that may or may not agree with us. So that's something that we can take away from this too.
With that, would anyone any questions like to share? You can also raise your hand, and Caleb will bring over a pad and paper. But anything you'd like to know or share, please feel free. I also want to say the SLPPD has been fantastic. There was no question that they were going to have someone here tonight. We didn't have to ask. They just said we're going to have someone there, and not only were they good in terms of making sure we were safe. I know they were checking on the homes of our council members and school board members. It was unclear, early on what the risk was for everyone. And they were great communicators as well with, I learned fairly early on that my name wasn't on the list. So there was a certainly amount of relief in that, but they were great. Yeah. You don't mind coming up here then in the microphone, people can hear then also online that are watching.
Hi, my name is John Ziegenhagen, and first I just want to say that my heart goes out to you, and my sympathy, and it was a strange Saturday. My son and his wife and our twin grandsons, 5-year-olds, were coming over, and they were going to come at 10, and they texted and said, we're going to be a little late. And we turned on the news, and then that's how we learned. My son and his wife are very close friends of one of your colleagues in the House. And so it was an unbelievable morning, the joy of seeing the little boys. And then feeling so, I didn't have any connection with Representative, but I'd seen her name, and I just felt overwhelmed with grief, and then joy, and grief, and then anger. How could this happen? And then after a while, I felt I didn't want to be in that angry place. It was like, oh, okay, what can I do? I'm just going to step up my involvement and give support to the three of you, especially because it's our district, and to others, and do what I can. So I've, not to the extent that you're feeling it, Larry, but I'm okay, but I'm not okay. But underneath that not okay is a desire to really step up and be a better person, treat people as people, and do what I can on the legislative side to advance what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. So, I want to say there's a lot of trauma for this, and there's no one person has more, one person has less. We're all experiencing this in different and unique ways. And I think a point you made is really important. Like I also, depends on the time of day, which emotion is most foremost in my mind. But like, it's okay to also have joy. We need to. And one of the ways that I'm dealing with this is starting to throw myself into work. Like, okay, I want to move forward and take some action and do things. But thank you. Appreciate
One of our colleagues said it best, and I can't remember if it was Representative Smith in our text chain. He said, I can already hear Melissa say, okay, this is enough.
Yeah.
Go back to work. This is a little bit much, is what she would say.
Yeah.
Go back to work.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Joan, and I guess I just also wanted to offer my condolences because I see Cheryl usually at least once a year, and I didn't get a chance to do that. And I would say on the morning it happened, I guess I didn't hear till I was on my way to the rally, and there were some people saying, well, you shouldn't go. Fortunately, 30,000 of us did go to St. Paul. And it was a very moving, Keith Ellison spoke and a number of other people. It wasn't the rally it was going to be, but it felt good to be there with people who really care and want to preserve our democracy. So, but I just wanted to offer my condolences.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I had plans to do something on that day around the rallies and was told,
We all got quickly vetoed. I had one picked out in Colorado to go to, and my kids were like, nope.
Yeah. And you know, it's important with things like this not to succumb to fear, right? So I really appreciate what Senator Latz said earlier about, you know, look, he's moving forward. We're going to do that. At that moment, you know, they were pretty clear to us that we weren't to go, but I appreciate everyone that did, and looked like a really great rally.
Good evening. My name is Jake Spano, and you three are friends of mine. I've shared some of my thoughts and my feelings with you, and I'm not really here to talk to you. I'm here to ask my neighbors something. If we could all maybe, if you can, please stand, and let's offer these folks a round of applause and thanks. You're all very appreciated. Thank you.
Well, maybe with that note, does anyone else want to talk on this topic? Look like you're about to stand up.
I was actually going to try and change the subject to policy.
Okay, I was just kind of setting the table for that. It sounded like a good transition point. Thank you, Mayor Spano, for doing that.
Get your tissues. That's something that'll really bring tears to you. This is a question for all three of you. On environmental issues, did we have to give anything up? Did we make any accomplishments? And probably for Larry, more so since he's on the committee. And then the next question is, with what we just experienced, was there any progress, or did we have to give up anything on gun and public safety issues? Which I think Ron probably is more qualified for. And with that, I'll sit down and listen.
Thank you.
Yeah. So on environmental and climate-related issues, most of session from my perspective was largely defensive, was largely protecting things that we had accomplished in 23 and 24. And we were pretty successful, not wholly, but we were pretty successful in protecting the most important gains, things like our 100% clean electricity by 2040. There were attempts to gut that and roll that back. On the progress on the environmental side we made on PFAS, on the forever chemicals. There were some tweaks to that were largely around things where there's no other options, or where, like, you know, you would have done it and then you wouldn't have been able to, actually, sorry, that was lead. But there were some tweaks there, but largely intact. You know, there probably was some progress on things at the fringe. We did put a lot of money, which Melissa Hortman would have loved, into trees as much as we could, in planting trees. And I think there's a real strong, it was something that was very near and dear to her heart. And I've already heard many comments from colleagues of, we're going to plant a lot of trees coming forward. You know, so those are, you know, and then I would say and we made some progress in some areas, but I think largely it would have been more of a defensive kind of a year holding things. On the energy side, for example, there were also attempts to eliminate our community solar garden program, net metering, which we resisted. We did not give in to any of that. And we wound up with a pretty bare bones energy bill. We did what we needed to, which is really important in this year. We funded government so that there were no shutdowns, but largely not a lot of progress, which is something that I really want to see going forward.
Another thing on the energy issue too, as well, while we extended some timelines for data centers, we took away the sales tax exemption, which was good because it was like the most in all the country that we were doing for data centers. And then we also put more environmental restrictions around them. So we added some environmental stuff on the data centers too.
Some other stuff on environment I just realized. So the LCCMR stuff, the stuff that comes out of the lottery funds, that was passed and continued. So like there's some things that kept going that are really good, that some of the things that make Minnesota special that we were able to protect and keep moving forward. Yeah.
There's a low-income, moderate to low-income discount on solar garden rates, electricity. That was preserved?
Yeah, that's the community solar garden program, and we revamped it was it last year or 2023? We revamped it, I think, in 2023 to make it, I think it's at least 40% of it focused on low income. That's one of the things that they tried to kill, to put away, and we did not. That stayed in place.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were some other proposals to change the or eliminate the community solar garden altogether, and there was quite a policy debate over the numbers, who benefits, are the regular ratepayers subsidizing or not subsidizing the solar gardens, and so on. There was no consensus reached on how to approach that, and without a consensus on something like that, especially with the numbers in the legislature right now, you just can't pass that stuff or make substantial changes. And so a lot of what we did, and I'll get to the public safety stuff, but a lot of what we did was defensive this year, was to, from my viewpoint, stop the rollback of some of the major progress that we made in 2023 and augment it in 2024. We can get into that as we have our conversation here, but you asked specifically about gun safety, gun violence, and then criminal law. We did pass one gun bill this year. It was my initiative in response to a media story about e-tracing and the fact that a number of law enforcement agencies in Minnesota, when they were trying to track the provenance of firearms used in a crime or found at a crime scene, they weren't going to the federal e-trace system. They weren't searching that database. They weren't entering the data that they have for the firearms that they found, and they were not checking the box to allow their data to be visible to others that are also trying to find firearms. So we passed a mandate that they do that, and then the additional mandate was, when circumstances are appropriate and it was reasonable to do so, that they get ballistics testing on the casings that are found at crime scenes as well. There's an expense related to some of that, and so part of it, we exempted the DNR, for example, that's doing mostly permit enforcement, not crime scene work. We didn't want to have to require them to get every shell casing tested, right? We exempted the State Patrol, which is primarily traffic enforcement and supplemental, accident investigation, stuff like that. But the agencies that do the criminal investigations respond to the crime scenes. They'll be involved, so we can trace the provenance of those firearms. So that was passed with bipartisan support. There were the usual bills introduced to roll back some of the background check work that we've done to make changes to the red flag law. There were bills that were introduced for stand your ground and for some of the more traditional Second Amendment advocate, what I would say is off of the moderate range, and at least in the Senate, we simply didn't have hearings for those introductions. There certainly wouldn't have been the numbers or the consensus to pass something like that, so they did not go anywhere. We did find substantial funding for training for law enforcement in the Philando Castile Fund, which will help law enforcement learn better techniques, augment their skill sets in how to use force appropriately and responding to mental health incidents, in de-escalation techniques, those kind of things. A better trained law enforcement community is one that responds better reduces the use of force, the loss of life unnecessarily, and also engenders more community confidence in law enforcement, which with that trust, people are more confident in reporting what they know about incidents that have occurred or might occur to help prevent crime. So we did that. We did some substantial funding for crime victim services, including putting into place a few longer-term funding streams for what we've created now, a special revenue fund for victim services. What we saw in the wake of the assassinations was the use of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. The law would have certainly allowed the use of drones for the searches that were involved in this particular case, but there was a little more ambiguity about whether drones could be used in certain other circumstances. So we had some guardrails around there. We continued to apply some clear guides or requirements for use around drones. So we're trying to balance privacy over, people's backyards and so on, with the need to find, people who are missing, if there's some idea there. And we did pass some laws relating to tracking of motor vehicles that are suspected as stolen or are fleeing, to allow tracking devices to be affixed to a vehicle under certain circumstances to hopefully reduce the high-speed chases. So with all the implications that can have for public safety. There's more on the public safety area we can go into if people are interested, but we'll leave it at that for now. At some point we should talk about the DWI bill. Yeah. If we get into public safety issues, should we just tackle that right now? Sure. In the wake of another tragedy, the Park Tavern tragedy, where a person who was over .30 drove drunk through the patio, killed 2 members of our community and injured, I think, 11 others. Representative Kraft and I carried the bill in our respective bodies to to increase the use of the interlock device by both reducing the financial barriers to getting it installed, by lengthening the duration of the look-back period for when it's required after people have repeat offenses. It applies only to repeat offenses, and scaling up the length of time that people have to be on the interlock in order, depending on their history, and so on. So we took some of those steps, and as a part of that bill, we took some other steps also to augment the ability of law enforcement to effectively respond to DWIs, to extend the use of interlocks to criminal vehicular homicide cases, where I would argue that it's even most important. What we know is that people tend to drive, whether they've got a valid license or not, because they need to get to their job or they need to put food on the table and pay the rent and so on. And they take the chances that they're not going to get caught. And what we want to do was create incentives and some hammers to get people into the interlock program, where alcohol use has become a problem for them, to protect the safety for all of us. And I think our bill in the end struck a pretty good balance doing that, and it passed unanimously or almost unanimously in both bodies. Kudos to Representative Kraft, who done a ton of work on that bill. It's a policy area I've been familiar with for a long time. Representative Kraft hadn't been, and he dug into it. So,
yeah. And that one was, as Senator Latz mentioned, very bipartisan. I had a partner in the House, Representative Jeff Whitty, who worked with me closely on it. So, do we want to give a little background on the session, special session, and then,
sure, and then open the floor up?
Yeah,
there. Sure. Well, I'll take a couple of minutes, and then we'll each give a take on it. This was the first year of a budget session for us. We budget in Minnesota on a 2-year cycle. And that means the only work we really had to do as a legislature this year was pass a budget that would keep government functioning beyond June 30th, which was the end of the previous budget appropriations authorizations. So we ended up passing about a $66 billion budget for funding the 2 years, all the areas of government, some of them, including the judiciary and public safety bill that I was in charge of, got passed before the end of the regular session on May 19th. A lot of the other stuff didn't come together before then, and that we had to go back for a special session. Much of the, for my own main area of policy focus, because I chair the committee, was in funding the courts, funding the Department of Human Rights, funding the Department of Corrections, which means the prisons and the probation system in Minnesota, funding the BCA and half of the Department of Public Safety, the public defenders, civil legal services, guardians ad litem, were all within the jurisdiction that we worked on. We also worked on data practices and privacy issues for government data. Civil liability issues fall within our jurisdiction as well. All the other budget areas ultimately did get taken care of in special session. We were able to turn that around in less than 24 hours, even though the agreement was get it done within 24 hours. Much to my embarrassment in the Senate, the House adjourned before we did, which was probably the first time in my service in the legislature that happened, probably because you had a 67-67 tie and everything was pre-agreed. In the Senate were 34-33 Democrats, and there were still some in the minority party that wanted to use the platform to make their political points, which I respect, and it worked out fine. It just took us a little bit longer to get that work done in the special session. A lot of the work that we did was defensive. Other than some minor tweaks, we were able to keep family and medical leave, for example, earned sick and safe time. As Cheryl indicated, we were able to keep the K-12 formula tied to inflation. We maintained nursing home workforce standards. We couldn't hang on to Minnesota care coverage for adults. That was the number one priority for the Republican Party in Minnesota. Was they came in saying eliminate it altogether. There was a compromise, keep it for kids, not for the adults. Just keep in mind, this is not a free program. This is like anyone else who would qualify for it. It's a premium-based, income-eligible program. Participants pay into it based upon their income eligibility, and they pay ultimately, like everyone else, for the medical services that they receive as insurance coverage. That one, it passed with only one Democratic vote in the House because it was a part of the agreement to keep government running, and there were only a few Democratic votes in the Senate. The rest of us, including me, voted against that provision. We did pass a bonding bill, also a capital investment bill, which even though we had $1.35 billion worth of fiscal capacity for a bonding bill this year, the only consensus agreement, which required a supermajority of 3/5, was on a $700 million package. So there were no individual or very few individual projects in the bill. St. Louis Park, Hopkins, Edina all had some priorities that we weren't able to put through in individual projects. Almost the entire bill was focused on asset preservation of public buildings, state-owned buildings, University of Minnesota, Minnesota State, and so on. There's at least two major exceptions I'll highlight, and then I'll rest. One is $55 million that went toward building a new Bureau of Criminal Apprehension lab in Mankato to cover southern Minnesota. Full state-of-the-art crime lab, basically. Long overdue, desperately needed, very important. And the other thing I'll mention is that there was a new building is being funded out in Anoka that will provide beds for treatment, residential treatment for mentally ill individuals. You've probably heard about the people in jails. Jails are now our largest institution housing people with mental illness. We have a 48-hour law that says they can't be held any longer than that, but there's been no place to put them. The beds have been full in the residential treatment areas. So this money going into building a new facility is going to help ease that burden. Won't be the overall solution in the end because we still have a bottleneck with community-based services that we still have to invest in. But this is a really important step forward in that area. With that, I'll let it go and hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
So I serve on the Education and Finance Committee as a co-chair. Then I'm also on the Tax Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. So Ways and Means sees all the bills before it hits the floor. And with the 67 tie when we were co-chairing, which was actually only about the last 2 to 3 weeks of session before targets came out, and you were able to hear bills. It was really unique to be on Ways and Means because even before that, our Ways and Means chairs agreed that nothing would move to the floor unless there had been agreement amongst both parties. So we did a lot of our negotiating before we had to negotiate with the Senate, which it was an opportunity to get to know each other as co-chairs for, I would say, and I think Co-Chair Krisha would say this too, they had not had to put a budget together for quite a few years, so it was a good opportunity for him to see, like, no, you're not, you just can't lob like what you want at me. We have to like sit down and actually put a budget together because we have to fund our schools. So we got a bill off the floor after almost 4 weeks of negotiating with each other, and then that made us kind of a stronger team house when we got a cut target. So we had very little money to begin with coming out of the House, and then we had a $420 million cut to education and the tails to work with the Senate. So we had to like make a lot of tough decisions. We tried our best to keep money out of the cuts out of the classroom, but some will be affecting our kids next year. But we were able to do the indexing, which is still such a big deal because it guarantees districts to have a 2% increase every year with a 3% cap. And so this year it was a 2.75% increase. Next year it'll be a 3%. And the year after it'll be 3%. Then it's forecasted to go back down to 2%. And that's just really important because it's been about 20 years of underfunding where districts have had to got some time to dig out of that hole, but the indexing will be a big deal. We were able to make some cuts to get some money to districts to make a bridge on compensatory aid, which is a part of the formula that helps kiddos that are struggling more. That had been linked to free and reduced forms. That was the proxy we used to figure out, like, okay, we're going to make this assumption that because you have low socioeconomic status, you might be struggling in school. So we have a task force that's going to look at that and revamp that. But until then, we found some money to give the schools by making cuts in other places to kind of do that bridge. We were lucky in the healthcare bill that they were able to put a little bit more money into school-linked mental health. And we, kept most of our ed policy chairs worked really well together by saying we're only putting something in that we both agree on, and we try to kind of live by that, and I think it worked out pretty well. What came out of the House looked radically different than what we ended up with because we had moved some money around for the House. GOP had wanted some more flexible money for our schools, but when we got a cut target, they were quick to be, understanding that we'd have to put that towards the cut target. But all in all, it was a defensive session. In the tax committee, we almost didn't have a tax bill for quite a long time because we don't really have to unless the targets are looking to the tax bill to raise revenue. And that is what they did with the joint targets, looking at that, getting rid of the tax exemption on the electricity, sales tax exemption on electricity with the data centers was going to help us with revenue. So they did have to pass it, but it ended up being a very bare bones tax bill. There was some tax increment financing changes I carried for Edina that made it in, but unfortunately we had a really great pilot project that St. Louis Park had come up with for 3 years, and Minnetonka and Ridgefield had been part of it to take excess TIF increment and put it into Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and they kept the data and did just an incredible job building more units of affordable housing. I could not get it past the Senate tax chair to make it statewide, but we'll keep working on it. And then we were able in the tax bill to keep the money we'd put aside for affordable housing as well. So there was a lot of defense, a lot of lessons learned, a lot of better working relationships built, I think. I hope that will continue. I don't know what other area I want to chat about, but those are the two or the three that I know the most, but I'll toss it over to Larry.
Thanks. I will start by just taking a step back and thinking about, for me, this session relative to last one, right? I came in 23, 24, historic trifecta. I mean, it was, I think, from my perspective, amazing, pretty fun. And this probably, if you look at the totality of it, is the other way, right? From the way it started with our, boycotting of the first few weeks from our perspective to protect democracy, to then a period of about 5 weeks where the Republicans had a one-seat advantage and had a one-seat advantage on all committees and also on the chamber floor. That meant that while they couldn't pass anything, they could dictate the agenda. And they largely did that and brought up a lot of bills that had no chance of passing. And then we finally, when the special election was done, we shifted to a 67-67 tie. And that's a lot of the stuff that Cheryl was just talking about, where the chairs had to work together and forge the relationship so that we could actually, get stuff done at the end of session. And I think it was really unfortunate that had to wait so long to happen. And then, we end with the special session, which I think if you look at it, and Melissa Hortman would say, if you look at it compared to other special sessions in divided government, was probably better than most. So we got our job done. But then, this session, I think, will always be dominated by what happened by the assassinations. So overall, not a good session. And I think one of the things I take away from it is, as hard as we work and to try to make it work from a 50-50, 67-67 perspective, legislatures were just not meant to be split 50-50. They just work better when there's a majority and a minority, at least the way ours is set up. Things I want to highlight, we talked about energy was defensive. I also sit on transportation and state government. Transportation was also a lot of defensive stuff. We were able to, with a lot of work, protect a climate impact of highways bill that I got passed in 2023 that's kind of nation leading, and they really made a really strong attempt to push it back, and we were able at the end to pretty much keep it intact. There are cuts to transit funding, which we tried to minimize, but there are cuts there. The surcharge on EVs was for folks that are EV owners, because they don't pay the gas tax. There's a surcharge that you pay on an annual basis on tab fees. It was raised substantially, I think way too much, but we were able to cut that back a little bit in conference committee, but it's too much. In state government, there was, but I will also say in transportation, we were able to fund government and protect a bunch of stuff. So it's not all bad news there. In state government, there's a lot of solid work, a lot of unglamorous addressing fraud work. You'll hear the parties go at each other saying, well, we didn't create a new office of inspector general at the highest level. And part of the reason we didn't is it's very expensive to do that. And also it's unclear whether that would really address the core issues that we're facing from a fraud perspective. But there's probably a half a dozen other, maybe even more like 10 bills spread out a bunch of different committees where there was really good specific work being done to address specific openings or weaknesses that could result in fraud. So there was a lot of good non-glamorous work done in that committee, and a lot of it on a bipartisan basis. Housing has been something I've been working on to try to push forward on what I think is really necessary statewide, really pushing cities to be more open on zoning changes and zoning flexibility to allow us to build a lot more housing in places that it really makes sense to build it so that we don't sprawl. And again, this year we did not, there's bipartisan support for it, and there's also bipartisan opposition. We were not able to get it across the line, but we did make some progress there. There was some things we were able to build in so that as Minnesota Housing puts out funding for communities, something that will be built into scoring is some of the flexibility that is in those communities for different types of housing and for different approaches to zoning. So we're making some progress there, and there's other areas there. So with that, the other thing I will say is in the past 2 years, I got 27 bills done that became law. So 14 and 13. This past year was 3. One was the DWI bill, which I think was really impactful and something I learned a lot about from Senator Latz and others. Another one that I did was on mental health. I've tried to do a mental health bill each session, each year, because I think it's just an area with not enough focus. In the past, I've actually done mental health bills with Senator Hoffman. And so this bill, one that came to me from an organization, was about, families that have kids that are experiencing really serious mental issues. When they're boarding in a hospital and they can't take them home because it's dangerous to them, to their kids, to other kids, they'll get reported to child protection. They'll be cited for neglect, and that's just wrong. And so they're not supposed to be, but we made it a law that they should not be. And another area, which is one of those things that will actually have some transit benefits and is kind of a little thing, but in the seven county metro area where there's metro transit, there's a transit assistance program for folks with lower incomes. And their biggest challenge in getting people to use it is people don't know about it. So what we are doing is we're integrating the application for it along with the Minnesota Benefits Portal where people get other benefits like SNAP and other benefits, so that there's one place where if you go there, hey, you can learn about this as well. So those were my 3 bills. With that, I think we should open up for questions. Please feel free to come up here. While folks are coming up, I'm going to read.
I forgot to say I passed 3 bills too. One was clarifying some needed clarifications around the Hometown Heroes bill for our firefighters. One that I passed off the floor was actually for my Republican co-chair because he couldn't be there that day and it was calendared. And then, of course, the education bill. And then I got a chance to have a TIF bill in the tax. But usually as chairs, we give all the good bills to people that aren't chairs to carry. If you're a good chair, you do that. But no, it was hard.
Because they have the time to work on it.
Yeah, it was hard to, it was pretty tight in the House to get something passed. Everybody had to agree on it, which can be a good thing too.
Yeah. So I'm going to read one of the questions that was sent in. And if you have another one, please come on up here to the podium. But this question was, why shouldn't gun safety be treated with urgency, with the same focus and government action as our last epidemic, as COVID?
Good question.
Well, some of us have been treating gun safety with that level of urgency for a couple of decades. It took me 20 years to get the background check bill passed, but we did in 2023. Same time we got the red flag bill passed. In fact, there's still follow-up inquiries. I got a call from a Washington, D.C. based reporter asking why the red flag bill had not been used to confiscate firearms from the assassin. Bottom line is the tool is there, but you have to have someone who knows about it, who feels that there's a real threat, and who's willing to turn that person in. It has been used 135 times in its first year in existence, and 91% of the time firearms were removed for at least a 14-day emergency period of time. No doubt in my mind it's saved lives in terms of suicides and other things. I will be looking at an AK-47 type ban again. I will be looking at safe storage again as well. We'll be looking at capping capacity for magazines as well. I mean, these are ones that we keep coming up. We keep trying to move them, but they're hard to pass. They are hard to pass because, and this is not entirely a partisan issue. There are members on both sides of the aisle, especially some diversity within the Democratic side, who represent more rural districts where there are, it's more difficult politically to vote for some of this stuff. So we'll keep working it, though. It is a public health issue. It is absolutely a public health issue, and we should be treating it as such.
Yep.
But thanks for the question.
My name is Randy Kraft. I'm Larry's dad. It was my question. That was my question.
I knew that.
You're talking about, I've been proud of Larry since he was born, and it grows every single day. He has never done anything dishonorable. He's always acted with integrity. A father can't have a better son. That's all I need to say about that.
I don't normally blush, but I might be.
Is that what you paid me to say? No. But in terms of the gun issue, there's another thing that gets neglected. There are a number of accidents that happen in homes involving handguns. As a matter of fact, most of the deaths involving handguns are accidents. Now, if you had handprints that were required in order to get a gun to operate, a handgun to operate, that would prevent little kids from accidentally shooting their brother. And some of the other stuff, the idea that any hunter would be for automatic weapons boggles my mind. Okay, you don't use automatic weapons to hunt. Because you would
do,
destroy
you're not a
your
very
prey.
good hunter.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, some of the stuff just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And the idea that anyone is in favor of death boggles my mind. Thank you.
You're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah. Well, I think, I was really disappointed in 24 when we didn't get safe storage done. Because it's not quite the biometric stuff that my father was speaking about. But, and we had one of our neighbors come and speak about his experience when he was 14 and his 17-year-old brother shot himself. And so I was really disappointed that we weren't able to get that. But I so appreciate Senator Latz's leadership on this, and this is something we will continue to work on, where we can find some common sense overlap. I would like to do a lot more, but yeah. Next question, I can read from here unless anyone has one. I want to alternate between.
Who else is on your list, Representative
All right.
Kraft, to have come forward?
Here we go.
I think your mom's here.
That's
too.
not
She
my
can-
handwriting. I can read. You want me to read this, or you want to read it?
First
Go
of
ahead.
all, I know none of you sit on higher ed. So this is me as a retired person from the higher ed system, just raising concerns about how cuts at the federal level are going to trickle down to the state level, and what contingency plans might be in place to maintain access and opportunity for first-generation students, students of color, students that traditionally don't have access to higher ed. And I know, again, that you do not sit on higher ed, so I'm hoping that there are discussions relative to that. Cheryl?
With that, as well as with, we beefed up the student grant, tried to not have it have as many cuts, but there had been in the House, it was a really tough negotiation. There had been a lot of proposals to get rid of some of those programs that really help students that, our parents in trying to go to school and low income. And Co-Chair Wolgamott had a tough time with Co-Chair Rarick and some of the ideas. So luckily, when they went to the joint targets, there was a little extra money. So that did help. But we're worried about funding on all the research grants at colleges, especially around medical research. They did end up in the final bill taking a ding out of the Rochester medical program, but they had tried to do that with all the residency programs, which one of the reasons why we have such a hard time getting doctors in is because there's not enough residency spots. So that boggled my mind too. But yeah, that really is a concern.
Yeah.
So I did serve on higher ed for 4 years in the House and for my first 4 years in the Senate. And we flipped the funding model in Minnesota. When I first got into the legislature, we were using state general fund money to pay for 2/3 of the cost of higher education to the institutions. We ran into budget problems. And higher ed took the brunt of it because they're one of the few areas that the state funds that had a ready alternative source of revenue, which was tuition, of course. Which I would spell as TAX,
Right.
you know, in that debate, but we lost that debate. And so now the funding model is flipped. Now the state pays about 1/3 of the cost of higher education, and 2/3 comes from either tuition or research revenues. You know, we fought that battle. We keep trying to fight that battle. I'm afraid that we will probably end up back in a special session in the fall sometime because of potential funding cuts from the federal government. 37% of the state's budget is federally funded. So if you really want to look at it, it's about $24 billion for our whole state budget comes from the federal government in one form or another. And there are a lot of research cuts, as you know, coming through higher ed. And so we may have to revisit some of that along the way, but I'm completely in agreement with you. We were able to protect the North Star Promise, which is also important, which provides free tuition for the first 2 years of some of the higher education institutions for qualifying people.
Okay, thank you.
Well, since we're on education.
Do you have an education question?
I do. Hi, I'm Virginia Mancini. I serve on the St. Louis Park School Board. And it is budget related and it is related. So if anybody knows budget woes, it is a school board member. We understand because approximately 80% of the metro area districts are in some form of budget deficit. And we're actually kind of lucky in St. Louis Park that we didn't have as severe budget deficit as we could have. I think what I am most, I guess my ask here is I want a little bit more conversation and just to hear Representative Youakim's perspective on, so our number one cost driver, and it's also around many of the area metro, is transportation. And the governor proposed the $4 million, or was it more than that? Was it $40 million budget cut for special education transportation? And that's gonna hurt. It's gonna hurt our districts because there's already a cross subsidy, and I'm super grateful that the 23 and 24 legislative session helped to close the cross subsidy a little bit. But as Senator Latz just pointed out, with, for lack of a better word, I said insecurity from the federal government. What are we gonna do? Because districts, first of all, it's a constitutional right that students with disabilities go to school. And so the districts are going to have to pick up the cost for this transportation issue. So I'm just wondering what the heck the governor was thinking, and then also like what was the thought process and what are we thinking if we do come back, because St. Louis Park is already running at, so we're slightly below our general fund balance. So I'm just wondering what we're thinking.
Yes, it's hard because, like I said, we did get a cut target, and the governor had proposed a bunch of different cuts. What was frustrating when he brought his budget out is he did a lot of cuts in education, but the money that he was cutting didn't stay in education. It went to other parts of the budget. So we, at least when we trimmed, we put it somewhere else in the education realm, but that's how we got the compensatory aid money. And what School Board Member Mancini is talking about is we provide currently 100% reimbursement for special education transportation, and we cut that down to 95% reimbursement for the first year and then down to 90% the following years, in hopes that maybe better contracts can be negotiated, but also knowing that it's going to take a hit. And luckily, in our 23-24 session, we went from providing a 7% cross subsidy up to 44%, and now this year it hit 50. And we almost were going to look at cutting that, but now because the cuts were so severe in the 28-29, half of that was taken up by what they're calling a blue ribbon commission around figuring out the growth of costs in special education. But the kicker was $250 million if this committee doesn't come up with ways to help save $125 million a biennium in 28-29, the $250 million will come out of the cross subsidy. But I do have hopes that the committee is going to find some really good ways to try to mitigate costs, like keeping kiddos in level 1 and 2 instead of level 3 if they can, with more support staff, but it's
Totally
so
get that.
hard.
I appreciate and I understand we just, AMSD, we just had a 2-hour meeting talking about the different legislative decisions, but transportation costs aren't going down, they're only going up. So it's just, it's just something that needs to be on your radar because it's going to hit us. I don't have faith in the federal government right now.
Yeah, no, it's
so
our education, so we're a $26 billion budget for education K through 12 out of the state $66 billion budget, and $10 billion of that is federal money.
Right.
And we are very concerned about what's going to happen.
I got you on text.
I know, you know. And I very closely looked at the runs. Like you guys, unfortunately, like St. Louis Park and Hopkins, we did good on compensatory aid bump, but then transportation was harder. And then we had put a lot of money into student support personnel aid to get more school licensed counselors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers in the building. And when we set the budget, we had it at like $17 per student the first few years, and it was supposed to bump up to $48, and we had to slow that growth down, which killed me. And then negotiating with the Senate, I had taken most of the cuts out of library aid, but she argued with me, and I had to give her some, and that was the hardest part because it had to come out of student support personnel aid. And I'm like, okay, so you're making me choose between mental health of kids and books. This is not cool. But it was tough. A cut budget is tough. And I kind of went into it kind of figuring we'd end up with like a $40 million cut budget. And I had run a whole bunch of different scenarios for weeks and weeks to like, how are we going to do this? Thinking, hey, it's like at the time, it's like a $23 billion budget. Like I should be able to find $400 million. So much of it is attached to the formula and attached to kids. It's hard to find the cuts that don't touch the classroom. So we slowed down a lot of our getting teacher prep programs and things to get more teachers into the classrooms in order to, like most of our, like a third of our cuts came from that to try to keep it out of the classroom. But we have more work to do. And to do that, we're going to have to raise revenue. And a lot of our colleagues don't want to raise revenue, but we're going to need to.
I want to make a quick comment too. I mean, because this is, these kinds of really heart-wrenching discussions and decisions were had in virtually every budget area, right? It changed some of the words. And, in this one, and Cheryl can correct me if I'm wrong, but like one of the core issues is the fact that the federal government has had a responsibility to fund a certain amount of special education dollars to the states and has never done it. Right, and so that creates this, you call this cross-subsidy, this big gap, and we're starting to pick up some of that in Minnesota, but the core thing here is the federal government isn't doing its job. And when we have, right now, an administration that, with the current reconciliation bill, seems hell-bent on transferring an unprecedented amount of income and wealth from those that need it to those that don't, when we're talking about coming back for another special session, that's what it is, to deal with, maybe Medicaid, maybe other areas where they do that. And then we have impossible decisions to make where we're not going to be able to make up everything the hole that the federal government could blow in our budget. We're going to have these very difficult decisions where we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be cutting on the backs of kids with disabilities. And I can make that statement in so many other areas. But we will do our best. But I think the core issue here is that we're just not dealing with the income gaps and the disparity of wealth gaps that we have in this country.
Yeah, and Larry's right. When the IDA bill, the Individuals with Disability Education Act passed in the 70s, the federal government knew it was going to cost more, right? Because it does cost more to make sure kids are getting the least restrictive setting. And they were supposed to pick up 40% of it. They've never picked up more than 17. So that, like when I started doing advocacy work about 24 years ago, that cross-subsidy where the locals in the state were trying to pick up, mostly the locals at that time, trying to pick up the federal share, because it was like 40% federal, 40% state, 20% local. That's where that cross-subsidy started to grow, and it used to be about like 2% of a district's budget. When we finally were able to put money into the cross-subsidy in 23, it had grown to be about 10 to 12% of a district's budget. And we had to fight to put that 50% in by this year because some people felt like we shouldn't be paying the federal share. But kids can't wait. And we've been arguing with the federal government to pick up their federal share for the entire time. And every congressperson you talk to, both sides of the aisle, agree we should do it, but it's not sexy, it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, and it always falls to the bottom of the list, kind of like higher ed does when it comes to investments as well. So we have a lot of work to do.
Other questions?
Fine.
All right.
I'll ask the question we're all thinking. D, Marcus. If the federal government isn't going to fund things for people, can we stop giving them money and keep it in the state? Is there any possible legal way to keep our money? Because I'm pretty sure we give them more than we get back from them.
Oh, we do. We only get about 30% back.
Can we just stop doing that? I'm sorry, but I don't pay taxes to, enrich fascist criminal billionaires. That is not, I do not consent to that in any way.
My 24-year-old asked if he could stop paying federal taxes, and I'm like,
can the state,
no.
but can the state specifically?
Unfortunately, the federal government, their laws override state law. We could pass a state law that says you don't have to pay. I'm sorry, but no, if they set the tax rates, you can use all the tools in the toolbook or in the toolkit to minimize your taxes, but
So
still
we
got to
can't just
comply with
conveniently
federal
forget
tax
to
law.
send the money to them?
No.
Like at a state
Well,
level?
you can. I mean, but there are consequences if you choose to do that, right?
Yeah.
so they're not going to find it anyway, right?
I mean,
Yeah, the comment for those that might not have heard it was, well, they're not funding the IRS very well, which is true, which is a problem because that will also be an impact on revenues too.
yeah,
You
so
never
where
want
is
to
the money
cut. You never want to cut the organization that's like they're doing with the national parks. That actually brings in money, and they've decided to
know.
cut it. It's like I don't understand.
How are our state parks doing? Are they gonna?
They're doing well. They're doing a pilot project right now when you renew your tabs that you can buy your state park sticker, which mine conveniently works out just right
they
in
didn't ask
another
me
month.
about
So.
Yeah. I understand your question, but yeah, it would cause, we're not in the middle of that, the relationship between, they pay directly to them. Yeah, it would be hard, unconstitutional probably. It'd be.
We are suing them a lot though, so hopefully that will help.
Okay. And are we protected from like if they try to send in the National Guard here for any reason? Are you guys talking about what we need to do about that?
Well, the courts have, at least as of now, the federal, I think it was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that the president did have lawful authority to take over the California National Guard on the legal basis of the Insurrection Act, which absolutely boggles my mind how a court reached that conclusion. There wasn't any imminent threat or danger to the safety or security of the United States of America, which is the basis for that authority. But the courts have been giving the president a lot more leeway than I think the law allows.
And right now, there's a lawsuit too to say district courts can only affect the area that they represent. So right now, a district court can file an injunction and it goes across the whole country. But there's a lawsuit right now to say, nope, you can only do it in your little piece.
Yeah, actually, the big beautiful bill that the House passed included a provision that addressed that very specifically, and then some of the members of the House, even the conservative Republicans, said they didn't realize that provision was in the bill. If they had, they wouldn't have voted for it, and so on. Don't know if that'll survive the process, and there'll be a constitutional challenge as to whether or not the Congress can limit the jurisdiction of the courts in that manner. Yeah. But those are battles yet to be played out.
I will say, we do talk about these kinds of things quite a bit, and we're in coordination with the executive branch. I mean, probably one of the more effective approaches to this has been suing, right? Attorney General Ellison has done it very, very effectively. So, we'll keep that. We'll keep coordinating with that. But there are limits to what we can and can't do.
And some of our colleagues across the aisle did write a letter to the Congress folks about, please don't make these cuts to Medicaid. So it's kind of a bipartisan concern about the Medicaid cuts, at least.
Any other questions?
I'd have a good one that we end on a good note here.
Okay, Larry, what ice cream flavor are you serving next?
The question is what ice cream flavor I'm serving next. Well, that's a good question. Well, I tell you, a new one that I've come up with that one of my kids particularly loves is blueberry mint sorbet. So there you go. Yeah. And for those that don't know, I'm kind of an ice cream fanatic. And especially during session, I make ice cream on Sunday nights, sometimes do it on Instagram, and then I bring it in. And if you come and visit me up at the Capitol, then we can share some ice cream.
And then sometimes we get it in the caucus.
Yeah.
And you're clearly not lactose intolerant.
No.
Thanks for making the sorbet.
Yeah. All right, should we?
I have one more, and I know you, Larry, and I know Cheryl well.
Would you want to come up so people can hear you from the
my teacher
folks?
voice, so
All
that-
those folks watching from home,
There's people watching at home. Okay, well,
I doubt it, but
It's 2 o'clock in the morning when this gets rerun.
Yesterday and today in the Star Tribune, they released a poll showing the approval ratings in the metro area versus greater suburban and greater areas of Minnesota. And I am asking for some hope. It does seem to me that the urban and suburban, and with St. Louis Park notwithstanding, and greater Minnesota divide is growing. And if you look at the numbers, it is disheartening to see. And I feel my daughter goes to St. Louis Park High School, and she's always like, whenever we drive outside of this area, she's always like, oh my gosh, there are people who don't agree with us. Like it's a very insulated little community. So I'm just wondering, from your perspectives, as you plan going forward, because this divide doesn't seem to be dissipating, it seems to be becoming more entrenched. Where's the hope? Like, what are you doing to build that? Because you're at the state level, and your objective is to serve all of Minnesota, not just St. Louis Park. Although I appreciate all of the service that you've done for us.
So this kind of brings the conversation full circle, I think, from where we began. I think part of our responsibilities as public leaders is to treat people who have different viewpoints as people who have different viewpoints, not as as non-persons, not inhumanely. In our rhetoric, how we characterize the differences. Senator Gustafson made this comment because she's getting a lot of stuff on social media too, and she said it's as if they don't even think of us as people. And I get that. We all we think about our political leaders as embodiments of the values, if we support what they're doing, of our values, as our proxies in office to try to implement the policies, the values and principles that we support, that we would like to see our community represent. And sometimes we get separated from the fact that, we have jobs, we have families, we have kids and parents, and, if you prick us, we will bleed. I mean, we're people too, and if we focus on talking about each other in a better way, and maybe toning down some of the viciousness of the rhetoric and the anonymity which goes with it when you're online, I think we can help set a better tone. And part of it, has been forced more in the House now because of the tie than in the Senate, but you're forced to deal with people individually because you have to reach agreement to pass things. You simply, in my view, you can't demonize someone if you know them as individuals in the same way as if you don't know them that way. So that's responsibility that all of us who hold public office, I think, have to keep in mind as we speak publicly about things. This community has a certain set of principles and values, and it's true. If we go, I have a really hard time identifying with the people who are so ardently Second Amendment advocates on gun rights that they think of a firearm as a God-given right for them to possess, unfettered, unrestricted. I can't identify with that, but there are people who feel that, and they're active in the political process as well. And if I want to pass more gun violence reduction legislation, I'm going to have to figure out a way either to reach some of those folks or to convince some of the people that I need the votes of to not be as beholden to some of those folks as well. And look, they have different views. They're entitled to that. This is a democracy. They have a vote, just like I have a vote. But for the sake of all of us. And the other thing I would say is if we look around in what we passed, and Larry went into some of this, Cheryl went into some of this, we passed a $66 billion budget in the state of Minnesota. We funded and we passed policies that will take care of a lot of the common principles and values that we all share as Minnesotans. We strengthened mandatory break laws for bathrooms and for meals. We increased workforce development funding. We mandated a report on the cost of fraud and misclassifying workers. We passed a stabilization of premiums in the individual coverage market with a reinsurance plan. We created a homeowners association ombudsperson, created a housing insurance task force to look at homeowners insurance that we're all paying either through our rent or through our mortgages or the homes that we own. And we did a lot of stuff on a bipartisan basis that reached consensus, especially this year, but even in years when there are more political divides, that are just good government things to do that aren't Democrat or Republican, but they're the right things to do for our communities. And the more I think we elevate that and recognize we have more in common than we have in differences, that will go a long way, I think, toward lowering the temperature and facilitating the improvement of our communities that we are all elected to try to accomplish.
It's a great question. Following the assassination of Melissa and Mark Ortman, my hope level was pretty low. And it's not now. We don't get to pick who we work with. And therefore, we have to talk to folks that have very different views than we do. We have to work with them on a daily basis. And that's not a bad thing. And by the way, even in St. Louis Park, we're not monolithic. I think most of the people here probably have sort of similar-ish viewpoints, but there are many that don't. And so that's really good. Some of the things that I've seen over the past week and a half from my Republican colleagues, I've tried to to highlight, reward, lift up, because many of them have reached out to us to express their sincere condolences. And some have even pushed back against crazy stuff that was said online by people like Senator Mike Lee in Utah. He said some just vile stuff. And the people that push back on him, some of our colleagues, Representative Harry Niska, Representative Nolan West, and Representative Walter Hudson. And some of those people, I could tell you that I think some of the things they have said before are reprehensible, right? But they spoke out against people in their own party. And so that's the kind of thing to give hope. So maybe we can build off of what's happened here. And, you know, I connected with one of them where I said, thank you. And he's like, well, what can I do? I said, you've already done it. Like, that's the kind of thing that you can do. And maybe we can build on that because there's some, the vitriol and the conspiracy theories and the craziness that's out there on social media, we need to be pushing back on. And the most effective people to push back on it is when it comes from your own side, to push back on your own side. And so hopefully we can do more of that. And I'm going to say something that's kind of at odds with each other. I believe in bipartisanship. I have some great relationships with Republicans. There are some really good folks. As a whole, I think they're terribly misguided in what they think is needed for this country right now, and I think that's going to show. So I will work with them, but I also think that in this environment, we're able to do some good governance things, but to make big changes, right now it doesn't happen on a bipartisan basis. We see big changes happening at the federal level on the Republican side because they have control. 2 years ago, we saw big changes in Minnesota because the Democrats had control. And so I think that's just, if we need big changes, then right now it's not done in a bipartisan fashion. So I want to work bipartisanly, and from a climate perspective, you know, as I said, we didn't make much progress this year. We were defensive. I don't feel good about that. In many ways, I feel that I failed. Like for me personally, need to figure that out and to make progress, because the earth doesn't really care about our politics. But so anyway, it's a very interesting thing, but I do think some of the things we've seen over the past week and a half provide me some hope.
I think that provides me hope, and the next generation, I think, provides us hope all the time. You know, I always ask this question in my head, like, chicken and the egg. Is it politicians that make people more partisan, or is it people that make politicians more partisan? And it really is hard to decide sometimes, because I watched my co-chair, Ron Krisha from Little Falls, get his Republican endorsement stripped right before the end of session. Not just because he was working with the other side, but people thought he wasn't conservative enough. And because he had pushed back on some stuff. And the first thing I asked him was, your family's safe, you're safe, right? Because he's like, yeah, we'll be fine. But, you know, here's somebody who was trying to push back against, you know, some of the further right folks in his district. We see that sometimes in our DFL side too. There's polarization on both sides. We're not going to sit up here and say there's not. But making sure that, first I'm going to go dark, then I promise I'll end light. It's been really hard having a child that's LGBTQ this year after the election. We were really worried about the way things are going. And people say, oh, but I had a colleague even say, oh, but gay marriage is legal. And I'm like, for now. I see what's happening to our transgender community being dehumanized right now. And when I spoke on the House floor on this topic, I said, this is where it starts. But it's not where it ends. And history shows us it doesn't end well. So when do you raise that voice and say it's enough? And as leaders, I think we have a responsibility to be that role model. And when we have that choice to really stop and think, if this is where I want to start, where is it going to end? And I think this last week and a half, we saw some colleagues really stop and take that breath. Ones that had, as Larry said, been pretty inflammatory to the point of their rhetoric causing death threats against our members because they didn't see them as human. And I think that's where we all have that responsibility to show our humanity and understand and meet people where they're at, no matter how much we disagree with them, and get off social media. No, there's a place for social media too to show the humanity. There really isn't, to share stories. There's been some beautiful stories shared on social media about Melissa. But until we can step back and be the adults in the room and show our kids how we're supposed to treat each other as humans, it can be a really scary place. But I think this week and a half, despite the fact that it was absolutely tragic and horrific, Melissa had a lot more work to do. But I think leading by her example, that all of the legislators in the House were invited to her funeral no matter what their political persuasion was, because that's what the family wanted. And I think if we can all step up and be those adults, I think that's one of the ways we can bridge the gap. We have a colleague that just last week had a plan. They did an exchange through Raver Angels where she went up to red district, and the red district is coming down to hers, and having those dialogues. I'd go around, I always offer to members, I'll come out to your district and talk about education. Like, we need to do that, and we need to set that example. And sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes you want to act like a 5-year-old, but we have to get past that. And just being in community and seeing you all here tonight really helps. And I just want to thank you guys for that. And keep the questions up. If you had ones that you didn't have a chance to ask, please always, you know where to find us. Everybody knows where to find us. We have our emails and stuff in the back. But I just want to say thank you for being here tonight.